The scent of peonies still lingers in my memory, the flowers Cashin insisted on for his wedding day. Not because he liked them, but because Mom said they photographed well. Everything about that day had been curated to perfection, or so they thought. The dress code, the venue, even the guest list down to the last childless cousin, all vetted, all designed to make sure Cashin's big day felt like the crown jewel of our family's legacy. And me, I was the cracked pearl they tried to hide among the diamonds. I was 32 weeks pregnant, swollen in body and soul, but I still showed up. Not out of duty or forgiveness, but because I thought maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Maybe this time, my presence wouldn't be treated like a stain on white linen. I arrived quietly, wearing a soft mauve dress that skimmed over my belly. My hair was done simply, pinned back the way my grandmother used to do it, and I clutched the small gift I'd spent weeks curating, a handmade photo album for Cashin and his bride, filled with childhood pictures, family recipes, and pressed flowers from our grandmother's garden. A tribute to memory. A gesture of love. But love, in my family, was conditional. And I had long since breached the contract. Cashin barely looked at me when I arrived. His fiancée offered a tight smile, the kind you give a stranger who wandered into your yard. Mom's jaw tightened the moment she saw me. I saw the flicker in her eyes as she scanned the room, worried what her social circle would think if they saw the pregnant disappointment she tried to pretend didn't exist. It wasn't supposed to go this way. I hadn't come to cause a scene. I came to be a sister. I came to bear witness. But life, my life, had other plans. The contractions started just after the first toast. I gritted my teeth through the pain, fingers curled tight around my water glass. I tried to sit down quietly, to breathe, to will it away. Then my water broke. A sudden, warm gush down my legs. My breath caught, and I stood, barely managing the words. My water just broke. Every head turned. The music didn't stop. No one moved. No one. Except Mom. She stormed over in heels too high for grace, eyes wild, mouth tight. "Stop ruining Cashin's night," she hissed, her voice low but furious. When I didn't move fast enough, she grabbed a fistful of my hair and yanked me back. I gasped, but not from pain. From the disbelief that she, my mother, was doing this. That in a room full of relatives, not one hand reached out to stop her. Then came the shove. And the door slamming behind me. I stood outside the grand ballroom, rain drizzling down, heart racing and dress soaked. Alone. Abandoned. In labor. But I wasn't helpless. They didn't expect what I'd do next. The rain was light at first, soft like a blessing or a warning, I couldn't tell which. It tapped gently against the pavement outside the grand estate, where I stood barefoot and broken, my soaked heels discarded on the steps behind me. My breath fogged the cool air, mingling with the mist rising from the heat of my shame. The wedding music still pulsed inside, muffled by thick walls and thicker egos. I imagined Cashin laughing at a joke, maybe cutting the cake, Mom at his side whispering approval while pretending she hadn't just dragged her pregnant daughter by the scalp in front of 200 people. And still, no one followed. I leaned against the stone column, hand cradling my belly as another contraction rolled through me. The pain was sharp but not blinding. I could still think, still calculate the moments between surges, still feel the damp warmth of my ruined dress clinging to my legs. They'd thrown me out like garbage. Not even a call to 911. Not a jacket. Not a word. But I had my phone. I fumbled for it with trembling hands and pressed speed dial. Not Mom. Not Dad. Not even Cashin. I called the only person who'd never failed me. "Hello," came the voice, warm and anxious. "Aunt Grace," I whispered, voice cracking. "I need you." There was a pause, a breath of silence that felt like balm. "Where are you, baby?" I told her. "I'm on my way." While I waited, I wrapped my arms around myself and tried to understand what had just happened. Not just the violence, the humiliation, but the truth underneath it. I had never belonged. Not to them. Not really. I had spent years trying to fit into a picture that had no space for me. My pregnancy was an unplanned miracle. The father, a man I'd loved quietly for years, had died 6 months ago in a motorcycle accident. And while grief swallowed me whole, My family's sympathy lasted exactly 1 week before it curdled into contempt. "Why didn't you terminate?" Dad had said over coffee one morning, as if discussing a subscription he forgot to cancel. "You're not equipped to do this alone." I had nodded then. Not in agreement, but in surrender. I was tired. Tired of proving that love doesn't always look like theirs. A pair of headlights cut through the mist. Aunt Grace's car. She pulled up fast, hazard lights flashing. She jumped out in slippers, face drawn tight with worry. "Oh, honey," she gasped, wrapping a warm blanket around my shoulders. "You're freezing." I burst into tears the moment her arms touched mine. "Let's get you to the hospital," she said, helping me into the car. "They don't deserve you." They never did. As we drove, contractions mounting, I caught my reflection in the window. Hair tangled, makeup ruined, dress clinging like a second skin. And still, I had never felt stronger. They closed the door on me. But life, my life, was about to begin. And so was his. The hospital lights flickered as the doors swung open, harsh and sterile compared to the dripping twilight I'd left behind. Nurses moved with practiced urgency the moment Aunt Grace called out, "She's in labor, 32 weeks, water broke an hour ago." A wheelchair appeared beneath me as if summoned by magic, and I surrendered to it, too exhausted to stand any longer. My breath came in shallow bursts now, each contraction like a tide pulling me deeper under. But I held onto Grace's hand like an anchor. She never let go. A nurse asked questions, my name, my due date, whether I'd had complications. I answered between clenched teeth. A kind-looking doctor with kind eyes joined us in the delivery suite, calmly explaining the risks of preterm labor. "Your baby's lungs may not be fully developed," he said. "But we're ready for him." Him. That word cracked something open inside me. I hadn't spoken it aloud much. My son's existence had been more a secret than a celebration in our family. But in that moment, it felt real in a way it never had before. I wasn't just having a baby. I was meeting the only person who had ever been wholly mine. As they prepped me for delivery, Aunt Grace stroked my hair back and whispered, "You're not alone, love. I'm here. I've got you." That's when the first text came in. From Mom. "You've made a scene. Cashin's livid. You always find a way to ruin everything." Then another, from my cousin Lana. "Heard you faked labor to get attention." Classic. I stared at the screen, the words smearing through my tears. My stomach twisted. Was it grief or another contraction? I couldn't tell. I handed the phone to Grace. "Block them," I said. "All of them." She did. And just like that, the silence was finally mine. In the hours that followed, I labored with a kind of fury and grace I hadn't known I possessed. Every breath was a reckoning. Every push a release. And when my son arrived, tiny, red, crying like the wind, I cried with him. He was rushed to the NICU, his lungs still fragile, but alive. Beautiful. Hours later, as I lay in that dim hospital room, my hair matted, body trembling from the storm that had passed, Aunt Grace brought me a cup of tea and whispered the words I'd waited my whole life to hear. "I am so proud of you." And I believed her. Because this wasn't the end. This was my beginning. The hospital room was still, save for the gentle hum of machines and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. I sat propped against stiff pillows, my arms empty, heart full of a new and terrifying kind of love. My son was down the hall in the NICU, fighting with tiny lungs and the will to live. The nurses had told me it might be a few days before I could hold him. "We need to make sure he's strong enough," they said, offering warm smiles I couldn't quite return. But they let me visit, gloved and masked, my hand pressed gently against the clear incubator wall. I whispered his name for the first time that morning. Micah. Not a name passed down from anyone. Not a family heirloom or a tribute to a patriarch. Just a name that felt like light after darkness. Strength without cruelty. A fresh name for a fresh beginning. Aunt Grace stood behind me as I looked at him, her hand resting on my shoulder. "Micah," she said softly. "It suits him." It wasn't just his smallness that undid me, it was his resilience. Born early, unwanted by the people meant to love us most, he still arrived like sunrise. And I knew, even then, that I would become someone new for him. Later that day, A nurse handed me a small clipboard with hospital paperwork. Birth certificate details. Mother's name. Baby's name. Father's information. I stared at the blank line under father. The ache returned, not from labor, but from the love I'd lost before Micah ever had a chance to know him. Jude had been a quiet soul. A friend before he was a lover. He taught English at a small community college, read poetry out loud like it mattered. We weren't planning a baby, but the day I told him I was pregnant, he smiled like the sun was breaking through. He died a week later in a hit and run. No one from my family came to the funeral. I left the father's line blank and signed my name with steady hands. Olivia Grace Morgan. I added the middle name in that moment, not mine, but hers. A tribute to the woman who stood by me when everyone else walked away. Aunt Grace didn't ask. She just saw the form and nodded, her eyes misting. "You're rewriting everything," she said. "And it's about time." That evening, I received a voicemail from Dad. "I heard from your uncle that you had the baby. Hope everything's fine. Your mother's upset. We expect you to apologize when you've rested." I deleted it. Because some doors don't deserve to be reopened. 2 days passed before I was allowed to hold him. They called me at 316 a.m., the nurse's voice trembling with joy. "He's stable enough now. Would you like to come?" I didn't wait. I didn't brush my hair. I didn't care that the hospital gown hung loose on my shoulders or that my legs ached from labor and grief. I only cared about getting to him. When they placed Micah in my arms, I exhaled the last breath of the girl I used to be. She was gone now, replaced by a mother whose spine had grown from ash and flame. He weighed just over 4 pounds, fragile and perfect. His skin smelled of warmth and hope. I pressed my cheek to his soft head and whispered a promise, one I hadn't dared make before. "I will never let them touch you." I meant it. Because what they did to me, ripping me from joy, stripping me of dignity, standing silent while I cried out for help, I would never allow anyone to do to him. He would not grow up doubting his worth. He would not learn to shrink to fit someone else's comfort. Aunt Grace was waiting outside when we returned to my room. She had brought clean clothes, a toothbrush, and something else, a leather journal. Embossed on the front in gold was the word legacy. "What's this?" I asked, tracing the letters. "Something to start anew," she said. "Write it all down. Not for them. For you. For him." And so I did. I wrote about the wedding. The humiliation. The silence of the guests who once called me sweet girl and asked about baby names at brunches. I wrote about Mom's growl, Dad's absence, Cashin's indifference. I poured every thread of pain into that journal like unraveling a sweater stitched by shame. And when I closed the cover, I felt something shift. Like soil turned in early spring. Something ready to grow. Micah's health improved faster than anyone expected. On the 6th day, the doctor smiled and said, "He's a fighter, just like his mother." I smiled back, but said nothing. I wasn't fighting for acknowledgement anymore. I wasn't proving anything to anyone. I was building something. Micah and I were discharged a week later. Aunt Grace drove us home to her cozy apartment, where a bassinet waited near the window and soft blankets had been folded with care. It was no mansion. No estate with peonies and marble stairs. But it was warm, honest, safe. And for the first time in my life, I felt what family was meant to be. Settling into Aunt Grace's home was like learning to breathe again after years underwater. The small apartment smelled of cinnamon and chamomile, and the only sounds were the soft coos of Micah and the turning pages of the books Aunt Grace devoured beside me as I nursed him. There were no sharp words, no slamming doors, no tight-lipped glances exchanged like weapons. Just space to heal. To become. I hadn't heard from Cashin. Not once. Not even a passing message to ask if his nephew had survived the night he was shoved out of a wedding like an unwanted guest. And I realized with a quiet ache that I would never expect an apology. From him. From Mom. From any of them. They didn't just exile me that night. They revealed themselves. But the world has a way of circling back, doesn't it, of stitching irony into the seams of silence. 3 weeks after Micah's birth, a letter arrived. Not a text. Not a voicemail. A crisp, Formal envelope with a gold foil crust on the front, the crust my parents had designed for the Morgan family reunion, an event held once every 5 years with all the pomp and vanity of royalty. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was an invitation, elegant calligraphy on thick, cream cardstock. Join us in celebration of family, legacy, and unity. I laughed. A dry, bitter sound. The kind that tastes like blood when you've bitten your own tongue too long. At the bottom, a handwritten note in Mom's familiar cursive. Would be nice if you showed your face. Let's put the past behind us. Behind us. As if trauma could be tucked away like holiday decorations. Aunt Grace found me staring at the invitation hours later, Micah asleep in my lap. She didn't say anything, just waited. I think they want to parade us, I finally said. Make it look like nothing happened. That we're whole. That I'm forgiven. She raised an eyebrow. Forgiven for giving birth, for surviving their cruelty. I nodded slowly. Exactly. You don't have to go, she said. But if you do, don't go to be accepted. I looked down at Micah's face, peaceful and trusting, and something sharpened in my chest. I won't go for them. I'll go for him. To show him where he doesn't come from. We made a plan. Not for vengeance. Not for spectacle. For truth. Because some legacies deserve to be broken. And some daughters deserve to write their own. The reunion was set for late August, just 3 months after Micah's early arrival. I circled the date on Aunt Grace's calendar with a trembling hand. Not out of fear, but clarity. The past would not define me, but I would no longer run from it. I didn't reply to the invitation. Not a word. Let them assume I'd stay away as they had always hoped. Let them imagine me shamed into silence, too fractured to return. That fantasy comforted them, I knew. People like them needed their illusions. But I had Micah now. And illusions don't hold babies at 3 a.m. when they're screaming with gas and grief. Illusions don't whisper lullabies passed down from grandmothers who knew the cost of silence. Illusions don't heal. Truth does. Aunt Grace helped me find a dress for the reunion. Simple. Cream-colored. Soft enough to feed Micah in. She insisted on paying for it. Consider it your armor, she said, handing me the garment bag. You're not going to a battlefield. But you're walking into a war they thought they'd already won. The night before we left, I packed Micah's bag with care, his softest blanket, bottles, the onesie embroidered with little lion that Aunt Grace had sewn herself. As I folded each item, I felt my hands steady. My heart, too. I wasn't seeking revenge. I wasn't hoping for reconciliation. I was returning to reclaim what they'd tried to erase, my voice. When we arrived at the estate, I felt it immediately. That cold shift in the air. The careful choreography of polite society, where pain is dressed up in pearls and betrayal smells faintly of perfume. The lawn was dotted with white tents and pastel tablecloths. A quartet played softly under a trellis of roses. Waiters moved like ghosts, carrying trays of shrimp cocktails and sparkling water. And there they were. Mom and Dad, standing near the fountain, laughing with Cashin and his wife. As if nothing had happened. As if I had not screamed in labor while they closed the door. As if Micah didn't exist. I stepped onto the lawn, Micah cradled against me in a sling, and the world turned. The music faltered. Conversations hiccuped mid-sentence. Faces froze. Then flickered. And then, like clockwork, they rearranged themselves into smiles. "Oh, Olivia," Mom called, her voice high and bright like a sales pitch. "Look who finally made it." I walked toward them without flinching, my baby against my heart, my silence a thunder they hadn't prepared for. Cashin stepped forward, brow furrowed. "So, you came." I met his eyes. "Of course. Wouldn't want to ruin your day twice." A few nearby relatives chuckled, nervously. Mom's smile twitched. "Let's put the past behind us," she said, reaching to touch Micah. I stepped back. "This," I said, gesturing to Micah's small frame, "is not the past. This is the future. And you don't get to pretend you helped build it." Gasps. Stillness. Then I walked away, toward the buffet, where Aunt Grace waited with 2 plates and no judgment. Because truth, when spoken clearly, doesn't need to scream. The weight of Micah against my chest grounded me as I walked across the sprawling lawn, each step echoing louder than any raised voice ever had. The hush that followed my words clung to the air like humidity before a storm. But I didn't look back. Not at my mother's frozen smile. Not at Cashin's clenched jaw. Not at the cousins whispering behind manicured fingers. Aunt Grace handed me a plate. "Mac and cheese," she said, loading a spoonful onto mine. "It's probably the only thing on this table that doesn't lie about what it is." I laughed, really laughed. A sound I hadn't heard from myself in months. We found a seat under an oak tree far from the curated chaos of the party. Guests returned to their routines, though the energy had shifted. Laughter now came in shorter bursts. Eyes kept flicking toward us, me and the baby I wasn't supposed to survive with. The baby they had tried to erase. A woman approached us, a cousin I barely remembered, Lila, from the more distant wing of the family. She walked slowly, cautiously, like someone approaching a sleeping animal. I saw what happened at the wedding," she said quietly, kneeling beside my chair. "I didn't help." "I'm sorry." There it was. The first crack in the perfect facade. She looked at Micah then, and something softened in her. "He's beautiful." I thanked her. Not because I needed her approval, but because sometimes grace means letting people find their way back to humanity. Lila stood and left, but not before pressing a folded note into my hand. I didn't open it yet. More guests approached over the next hour. Some said nothing, just nodded or placed a hand gently on my arm. Others spoke carefully, measured words that hinted at regret. A few avoided me entirely. And then came my father. He stood at a distance first, a glass of scotch in his hand, watching us. The last time I'd seen that expression, he'd been delivering a toast about Cashin's unmatched potential. Now he looked like a man watching a story he no longer controlled. He walked up slowly, stopping just short of the blanket I had spread for Micah to nap on. "I heard you named him Micah." I nodded. "You heard right. Strong name," he said. "Biblical." "Not your Bible," I replied, voice quiet but unwavering. "Mine." There was a long silence. Then, softly, he said, "Your mother regrets how she handled things." "Does she?" I tilted my head. Before or after the guests started asking questions. He sighed, an old sound. "You've made your point." "I haven't even started," I replied. He didn't speak again. Just looked at Micah for a long moment, then turned and walked away. That night, back in Aunt Grace's guest room, I finally unfolded Lila's note. It read, "Thank you for saying the thing the rest of us were too afraid to. You cracked something open today. Maybe it can't be put back together. Maybe that's not a bad thing." I pressed the note to my chest. Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's a baby's breath against your skin and the slow, quiet crumbling of a tower built on silence. The next morning, Aunt Grace found me standing barefoot in her kitchen, staring at the kettle as it whistled. Micah was swaddled against my chest, still asleep, one tiny hand curled beneath his chin. "You look like someone who's just buried a war," she said, setting down her crossword. "I think I did," I murmured. "And all I had to do was show up." We sat in silence for a while, sipping chamomile tea. The quiet was no longer heavy, it was sacred. Like the silence after a storm when everything smells new. That afternoon, I began receiving messages. Some came as texts. Others slid into my inbox like shadows, cousins, aunts, even former family friends. Most were variations of the same theme. I didn't know it was that bad. I should have spoken up. I was afraid to get involved. Some were performative, seeking forgiveness without acknowledging the harm. Others were heartfelt, small attempts at repair. I didn't reply to all of them. I wasn't interested in becoming the confessor for a family's collective guilt. But I responded to a few, the ones that felt real. The ones that didn't try to rewrite history. Later that week, Mom sent flowers. White lilies. Her favorite, not mine. The card read, "Let's talk. For Micah's sake." I didn't respond. I didn't owe her another performance. I didn't owe her my son. But I kept the card. Not as a keepsake. As a reminder. Because history has a way of erasing women like me, the ones who leave, the ones who say no, the ones who name their pain in broad daylight. But I was writing it down now. In the journal Aunt Grace had given me. Page by page, I was telling the truth. Micah would grow up knowing that his mother didn't cower, that she stepped into fire and came out carrying light. I posted a photo of us that evening, me and Micah under the oak tree at the reunion, his small face nestled into my chest. No caption. No hashtag. Just an image. Let them interpret it however they liked. By morning, the post had gone viral. The comments flooded in strangers, survivors, silent watchers finally ready to speak. This is what strength looks like. I've been the sister no one defended too. You didn't ruin that wedding. You revealed it. For the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible. I was undeniable. The morning after the photo went viral, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages poured in not just from people I knew, but from strangers, women and men who had watched family bend them until they broke, only to blame them for the shattering. I sat in the rocking chair beside the window, Micah dozing in my arms, and read every single one. A woman in Ohio wrote, "My sister called me dramatic for crying at our father's funeral, because he left me out of the will. You made me feel seen." Another, from Georgia, said, "I was 8 months pregnant when my parents told me I was ruining their retirement plans. Thank you for naming the betrayal." Story after story. Wounds layered over time, dressed up in Sunday smiles and holiday photos. And all of them, like mine, had been hidden beneath the polite silence that families worship. But now we were loud. Not in volume, but in truth. That day, I did something I never imagined I would do. I opened the small box I kept at the back of my closet, one I hadn't touched since before Micah was born. Inside were photos of my childhood, a few crumpled letters, and a cheap camcorder I'd once used for college projects. I dusted it off, set it up on the bookshelf, and pressed record. At first, I wasn't sure what to say. My throat felt tight, my chest full. But then I looked down at Micah's face, so new, so untouched by the world's expectations, and I began. "My name is Olivia Morgan," I said softly, and I was erased. Until I wasn't. I spoke for 10 minutes. Not a rant. Not a monologue. A remembering. I told the story of the wedding. The shove. The silence. I spoke of my son, of the hospital, of Aunt Grace. Of the reunion. Of the moment I reclaimed my voice, not with fury, but with presence. Then I ended with this. To everyone watching who's ever been made to feel like the shadow in someone else's spotlight, this is your light too. You don't have to earn worth. You're it. I posted the video online. Within a day, it reached over 500,000 views. A few media outlets reached out. Morning shows. Podcasts. People magazine. All wanting the exclusive story of the woman thrown out of a wedding for going into labor. I declined most of them. I wasn't a spectacle. I was a story. And stories are sacred. But I agreed to one interview with a small, women-led podcast about breaking family cycles. The host listened without interruption, her eyes wet as I finished. When it aired, the title was simple. The wedding wasn't ruined, the silence was. And for the first time, I saw my reflection in someone else's voice. Not the invisible girl. Not the burden. Not the drama. But a woman. A mother. A beginning. The podcast spread like wildfire, not because it was scandalous, but because it was true. And truth, when spoken without apology, becomes a kind of anthem. A week after the episode aired, I received a message that made me pause mid-diaper change. It was from my high school best friend, Tasha. We hadn't spoken in almost a decade, not since college, not since my family had quietly poisoned the well between us with whispers. "Liv, I heard your voice today. I should have reached out years ago. I believe things I shouldn't have. I'm sorry." I stared at the screen for a long time. Tasha had been there for me during the messy years, when I wasn't quite the obedient daughter, and not yet the rebel they accused me of being. She had been my witness. And then she disappeared. But this message, it wasn't just an apology. It was a bridge. We talked that night for hours. She asked about Micah, and I told her everything. She cried when I told her about the wedding. Not the act, but the silence. "I can't believe no one stood up," she whispered. I would have screamed. And maybe she would have. Back then. Before the distance. Before we learned to survive by staying quiet. We promised to stay in touch. Micah slept between us on the couch as I spoke, and I looked down at him and realized something. He was already rewriting what family meant. Not just for me, for others. My inbox was now filled with messages from people asking for advice. How to set boundaries. How to say no. How to survive when the people who raised you are the ones who break you. I didn't have all the answers, but I shared what I had: stories. Because stories hold maps. And I was done hiding mine. Cashin's wife, Elena, messaged me too. Short. Awkward. I didn't know what was happening that night. I was in the back with the photographer. I'm sorry no one stepped in. I believed her. Part of me wanted to ask where she stood now. What stories she'd tell at brunch. But I didn't press. Sometimes silence isn't cruelty. It's cowardice dressed in lace. The most surprising message came from my cousin Stephanie, the one who always smiled politely at my family's cruelty like it was just a game she wasn't allowed to stop. You've changed everything. We see it now. Some of us want to talk. Some of us. I knew what that meant. A fracture forming in the Parker family dynasty. A split between the keepers of the silence and those finally ready to speak. I didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, I took Micah for a walk that afternoon, wrapped in his soft gray sling, his breath warming my collarbone, and we strolled through the park like any mother and child. People smiled. No one knew our story. But I walked like a woman who carried no shame. Because when you stop begging for love that comes with conditions, you begin to love yourself with a kind of ferocity that no one can take from you. Autumn arrived quietly, like a breath drawn between two verses. The air shifted. The trees let go. And so did I. I spent my days tending to Micah, scribbling in my journal during his naps, answering messages from women who had mistaken pain for obligation their whole lives. I didn't have a strategy, a brand, or a mission statement. I just told the truth. And the truth did what it always does: it spread. Aunt Grace often joked, you've accidentally become a lighthouse. But it didn't feel accidental. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the horizon in a blaze of gold, I received a letter in a heavy white envelope. The Parker family crest again. I hesitated, fingers lingering over the seal like it might bite. Inside was a typed letter from my parents' attorney. Olivia, please be advised that your parents have amended their estate plan. You are no longer a beneficiary. This decision is final and irrevocable. No emotion. No explanation. Just erasure, legal this time. A.P.S. followed in someone's handwriting. My father's. Actions have consequences. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was exactly what I expected. It was never about love. It was about control. But what they didn't understand is that I had stopped counting their inheritance as currency the moment they put me on the sidewalk in a soaked maternity gown. I showed the letter to Aunt Grace. She read it, nodded, and tossed it into the fireplace. They can keep their money, she said. You've got something far more dangerous now, freedom. We watched the paper curl and burn until it was ash. The next day, I went to the bank and opened a savings account for Micah. I named it the Begin Again Fund. I wasn't wealthy. I wasn't famous. But I was building something for him that had never been built for me, a legacy rooted not in expectation, but in truth. That weekend, a woman named Carolina reached out to me on Instagram. She was a therapist who specialized in healing from family trauma. She'd heard my story on the podcast. I think you're doing something extraordinary, she wrote. You're not just telling your story. You're giving language to others who didn't know how to begin. She asked if I'd be willing to collaborate. Maybe a virtual group. A space for others to speak without shame. I didn't answer right away. I held the message in my hands, heart pounding. Was I ready for that? Then Micah stirred in his bassinet. His eyes fluttered open. And I knew. I wasn't ready. I was born for this. 2 weeks later, I hosted the first virtual gathering. It was a soft launch, just 8 of us on a quiet Wednesday evening. Faces appearing one by one on the screen, each framed by kitchen counters, living room lamps, and the kind of tentative hope that only those who've been dismissed too often carry. There was Delia from Texas, who'd been disowned for marrying outside her culture. Janine from Toronto, A single mother like me, whose family told her she was selfish for choosing her child over a toxic marriage. A man named Haroon joined too. His camera stayed off at first. When he finally unmuted, his voice shook as he said, "I've never said this out loud. My parents only loved the version of me they created." Each story came with silence first, then tears, then laughter, soft, stunned, almost embarrassed, like realizing joy was still possible. I didn't lead like an expert. I led like a survivor. I shared how I had once accepted crumbs and called it a feast. How I had mistaken tolerance for love. How I had contorted myself to earn warmth in a house that always felt cold. And how motherhood, unexpected and messy and glorious, had taught me that I would never raise Micah to earn his place at any table. His place would be built into the foundation. We ended the call after 2 hours. Not with a plan. Not with a fix. But with something deeper: recognition. Carolina called me after. "Olivia," she said, "this is going to grow. You know that, right?" I nodded. Let it grow like wildflowers in the cracks they left behind. And it did. Within a month, the group had over 200 members. Some used their real names. Others didn't. All of them carried stories like scars and songs. We named the space the Silent Thread. Because that's what we'd all been, threads woven into family tapestries that pretended we weren't fraying at the edges. Now we were gathering, stitching ourselves into something new. Meanwhile, back in the Parker family circle, silence bloomed like rot. Cashin's wife, Elena, posted a photo with a quote from my podcast episode, no tag, no credit, but unmistakable. It read, "You don't ruin a wedding by giving birth. You ruin it by letting cruelty masquerade as tradition." The comments were subtle, but I saw them. "This sounds familiar. Cashin's sister. Wasn't that the girl from the reunion?" I didn't respond. I didn't have to. Because when truth catches fire, it spreads without asking permission.